It's quite interesting. You know, I presented last year at the same summit, and one of my closing challenges was the one of energy storage being the next game changer. And I'm delighted to actually be the chairman of the session where we're going to be talking about exactly that topic, which is really wonderful, and it still is the next big game changer for us. We're going to be, we've got a limited panel here, so we're also going to not only just have a panel discussion, but fall into a bit of a presentation around the different technologies. Because if you think about energy storage, the first thing that comes to mind is batteries. Now, it's not only batteries, it's storage as a whole. And one's got to look at, if you think storage, you've got to assess the efficiency of storage. How do you do that? How do you store? I'm always amazed when we go in the EIUG and Eskom talks about the pump storage schemes as capacity. It's not capacity, it's storage, it's battery. It's just a large, let's call it a water battery. And when we have curtailment like we've had during the months of May and April, it was largely to fill up the dam levels and in so doing actually charge the batteries, if you want to call it that. And it so happened over the weekends when it's really about energy and not about the maximum demand or the capacity of the system. It's just to charge the batteries. So, and that's a form of a battery. So I think without any further doing, let's fall into the discussion. And Richard, if I can ask you to take us through the storage, or I don't want to fall into the same type of calling it batteries, but the whole storage scenario, please.
Yes, that's fine. So we have a slide here that Ian has graciously provided. Thank you very much. So let me talk in very high-level terms about the world of energy storage. As Gerhard said, storing energy is not just a matter of batteries, which is storing energy electrochemically. You can store energy mechanically, which is pump storage. You can store energy thermally, in hot or in cold. So a variety of ways to store and use energy. And there are a variety of technologies to do that. And the form or the technologies used to store the energy is one way to segment the market, but a more useful way to segment the market for our purposes is to understand the difference between power and energy storage devices that are geared towards high power and energy storage devices that are geared towards high energy. So typically, and I'll use the word batteries, but I could be referring to a number of technologies. There are two types of batteries. There are batteries that are batteries or other devices like flywheels and ultracapacitors that are good at discharging short amounts of high power and injecting them into the grid or into the end user to do things like stabilize frequency and voltage and provide other ancillary services, or perhaps to provide 5, 10, 15 minutes of energy to smooth solar or to provide some other bridging function. And then there are other technologies that are good at storing multiple hours of energy to move energy from one time of day to the other. In general, in the storage business, there's no single technology that's good at everything. Most technologies tend, and the power energy distinction is really important because most technologies tend to break down on exactly those fault lines. They're either very good at high power or they're very good at high energy. So for example, lithium-ion batteries, which are probably the most talked about storage technology these days, are very, very good at high power. They're excellent at being able to discharge a small portion of their energy or accept a small portion of their energy and do this thousands of times at high efficiency without degrading the battery. But as soon as you deeply discharge the lithium-ion battery, the more frequently you do that, you degrade its capacity to hold energy, and the battery deteriorates quickly and needs to be replaced. So they're generally good at high power. Their weakness is high energy, whereas other technologies like flow batteries, the technology that I represent, are excellent at storing several hours of energy, discharging it, recharging, doing this thousands of times without degrading. So Ian's chart actually takes us through these technologies in a matrix that goes on the horizontal axis on power, so from a single kilowatt up through a gigawatt, and then discharge time. And I'm going to try to read this. I believe what you've got at the bottom, you've got capacitors. You've got, we've got capacitors, which are good at storing literally microseconds or seconds, or several seconds of power. And you see capacitors used in both stationary power in UPS functions or in transportation, high power buses, to provide this very short duration bridging energy up through flywheels. Again, energy stored mechanically in a spinning mass. Flywheels are typically used either in kind of sub 1 minute applications, or in some applications up to 15 minutes for frequency and voltage regulation. And then you've got a whole set of batteries and some capacitors going from left to right, providing increasing duration, and then able to scale from the kilowatt level up to the hundreds of megawatts. So, for example, lithium. So there's a large rectangle there for lithium ion, and it's showing lithium ion excellent in the I would say up to a few minutes or maybe a couple hours range, and scaling up to a megawatt. Although there are lithium ion systems being put out that are 20, 30, 40, 50 megawatts these days. Lead acid batteries operating in a narrower band. Some of the nickel chemistries a little below that. And then as you move out into the right, you get into technologies like flow batteries that are geared more to the longer duration functions, and also to the larger scale. And we believe these larger scales and longer duration will be critical in the mining industry, all the way up to much larger scale technologies like large scale compressed air, pumped hydro, and then hydrogen fuel cells, where if you're generating hydrogen renewably, hopefully, and storing it, that certainly is a form of storage. So one of the first questions you need to ask yourself when you're considering a project with renewables or without, and you're considering the role of storage, is what's the function that you need to provide? Is it just a few minutes or a few seconds of this high power, or do you need multiple hours, or do you need both? And in fact, if you need both, you may be building not just a hybrid power system in terms of diesel or grid plus solar. You'll be building a hybrid storage system where you may have one or two or possibly three different forms of energy storage to serve the different functions that you want to serve.
Thanks for that. It's interesting if one look at the graph. Oops, there's a bit of feedback. That it goes up to 1 gigawatt at the bottom, and please note the scale of that, because that's actually what we need. Is not these small kilowatt batteries that you put in your house just to take you through load shedding or something like that. If you're really serious about what we heard yesterday about the photovoltaics, and you want to run it through the night, then you need gigawatts of storage. Ian, I think you've been busy not in that space, but could you tell us a little bit more about what Basil Reed's doing in that space, please?
Yeah, sure, thanks. I don't know, is this working? Okay. So we're an IPP as BR Energy, and we're developing various projects in Africa and also here in South Africa. And one of the projects that we're working on north of our borders includes quite a substantial amount of energy storage. The region that we're planning to service, they're about 100 megawatts short of peak power, and the current solution is to generate that using diesel. So we're looking at putting in 30 megawatts of energy storage with 120 megawatt hours of capacity. That would be, so 4 hours to handle their sort of evening peak. And what we're finding is, talking to Richard's point, the redox, or not the redox flow, but the flow battery technology really does seem to be coming into a competitive space against diesel-fired power. Numbers quoted yesterday in terms of diesel power was about 25 US cents per kilowatt hour. And we're finding that depending which technology you choose, and It's early days in the negotiations, so we've got a bit of squeezing to do, but we're very, very close to that. I think currently we're seeing at about 27 cents, and that's assuming a 10-cent per kilowatt hour cost of charging electricity.
You're talking US cents.
US cents, yeah. And we're sitting at about 27 cents. That's including capex and giving us the IRRs that we're looking for and stuff like that. So I think the sentiment that's out there that energy storage is still a very expensive alternative, and really if you're looking for continuous power production, that diesel is still the most cost effective for those type of applications. The game is changing, and the energy storage companies are realizing that that's what they've got to compete against. So even with the lower diesel price or the lower oil prices globally, energy storage is really coming into its own. So we're pretty excited about it. I think it's going to bring a lot of benefit to the region that we're going to be servicing, not only in terms of providing that peak power where they have, they call them blackouts. They don't mess around. It's just a blackout. It's not load shedding or anything else. And so we'll be alleviating 30% of that peak demand requirement that they have, and cost effectively. And the big issue, as with most of these renewable or alternative type of technologies, is that there's consistency in terms of the future pricing growth. The price tariff increase in the future is pretty predictable. So you know what you're going to be paying in the future, and I think that's very, very important to anyone in terms of these long-term projects, and also in terms of mining. A mining project is typically a long-term project. You really need to know what those input costs are going to be, and as we've seen from yesterday's presentations, electricity is becoming a bigger and bigger input cost, a proportion of your OPEX going forward.
Thanks, Ian. I think yes, the caveat though is one has to look at the total cost picture. And the one thing that comes to mind with regards to storage is your efficiency and the cost of actually storing the energy. Now, it's got two components of it, of course. It's the capital cost of whatever medium you choose, but you also have to have the energy in the first hand to pump up the battery or to pump up the dam levels or whatever it might be. And typical cycle efficiencies range between 65, 70, maybe, and if you're really good, up to 80%. But the fact is you need to have the primary power in the first place. What is the typical new with flow batteries, the efficiencies one can expect, Richard, with new technologies? What's happening in that space?
Sure. So let me start out by saying when you look at the value proposition for an energy storage technology, particularly a high energy technology that you're going to cycle often, there are three critical components in the value proposition. The first is, of course, capital cost, the capital cost of the battery or the whole AC system. The second is cycle life. That's really critical because if you have a battery that can only deep cycle, and let's say to 80% of its capacity 1,000 or 2,000 times, that's going to be and you need to use it every day to its full capacity. That's going to be a lot different than a battery that can perform that function, let's say 8,000 or 10,000 times with its full capacity without the need for battery replacements over 20 years. And the third component is, of course, efficiency. And whenever we run the calculations, we find that not just that those three are the most important components, but the first two are the most important: capital cost and cycle life, which are basically two sides of the same coin, because you have to amortize the cost of the system over the entire operating life. Efficiency is important, but it tends to be secondary to those. Now, in terms of efficiencies for flow batteries tend to have DC efficiencies. That's the battery themselves, somewhere in the low to mid 70s. Best case, there are some companies out there talking possibly higher. That would be great. They should be challenged on that, and we'd like to see the data. But they typically come in on an AC round-trip efficiency, which is what you as the customers really care about, somewhere in the mid-60s to around 70%. And that's, for the flow battery space, probably what we can expect. Ian, I don't know what you're seeing commercially.
Yeah, we're seeing similar numbers. I must admit, some of the quoted DC round-trip efficiencies are definitely in the very high 70s, early 80s, which we've also questioned. But for our financial modeling, we're working on a 70% round-trip efficiency on AC to AC. As I said earlier on, assuming a 10 US cents per kilowatt hour off-peak power cost for charging, and the capital cost, the maintenance cost on them is surprisingly low. Well, the OPEX cost is surprisingly low, particularly with the flow battery technology. And that's one of the reasons why we tend to be leaning towards flow batteries. We've got a 25-year PPA that we're developing this project around, and we're looking for a 20-year life cycle. And the benefit of the flow battery technology is that it's a case of replacing the electrolyte every sort of 5 or 6 years, as opposed to the lithium ion or something like that, or the lead acid technologies where you've actually got to replace the entire battery. So that replacement capex through the life of the project has a major impact. So I agree with what Richard's saying. The efficiency is certainly something one has to take into consideration, but the cycle life is far more critical in terms of looking at a long-term project like what we're embarking on.
Interesting concepts coming. The cyclability. I can tell you a little story about in Anglo-American many years ago actually, we installed batteries in a container at Val Reefs, thinking that we can lop the peaks off the system. And the batteries got flattened a few times, and it was a dismal failure because of that very reason. And when we started to unpack that, we were told that, those were lead acid technology at the time. You should really only be using 10% of the battery, then it can last probably about 3,000 cycles. But you put this huge investment in to put many amp hours of batteries in, and you can only use 10%, otherwise it's a failure. If you take it with lead acids down to 0, you probably have 5 to 10 chances and charges, then it's gone, it dies. So, one's got to be very realistic about what you're actually saying. Flow batteries don't suffer that much, of course, which is really good. You can take them much lower down. But one's got to be very careful of the application, otherwise you burn your fingers quickly. And that's not what we want to do, because in doing so, the technology gets itself a bad name. It's similar in the case with fuel cells that I'm happy to see was at the top of your chart as well. Now, a fuel cell is nothing but a gas battery. And it is one of these things that as long as you feed it with gas, it'll quite reliably make you power. But if you cycle it after, let's say, however many hours, between 12 and 40,000 hours, you've got to change the membranes again at 70% of the cost. So it's quite expensive yet, even for that. So, there's no cheap solution here, seemingly. Although, having said that, I think that's just where the challenge lies. Now, how do you see the future, Richard, with development in terms of the megawatts that we're expecting? Because at this stage, we're really talking of relatively small, and we're going to be installing one as a test, but it's kilowatts, it's not megawatts. Do you see yourselves filling huge containers of many batteries to serve that need? Because at the end of the day, the business model should be competing with the cost of unserved energy. What does it cost not to have the power, not to be able to mine and run your operations 24/7? Is that the niche that you ultimately see developing into to enable the processes to run, or is it still selective in terms of just running let's call it the important parts of the process?
It's absolutely one of our central markets of focus. So for a flow battery, again, the virtue of a flow battery is that you can cycle it every day. You can use its whole capacity 3, 4, 6, 8, 10 hours every day without degrading its capacity, and you can do this for years. Where our company's slogan, which we've trademarked, is called "Duration without degradation." So you can do this. You can do this every day. So we want to find applications for our battery that require regular deep discharges. Maybe not every day, but I'm looking for applications where we're working hard at least 150 to 200 days a year. Because if we're not, and remember those three criteria, capital cost, cycle life, and efficiency, if you're not deep cycling the battery frequently enough, there are batteries that may have lower cycle life, but may have lower capital cost that could beat you. So if you only need to use the battery 30, 40 times a year, there may be some lithium-ion solutions, there may be lead-acid solutions, other solutions that could be more appropriate simply because you may have a lower first cost of ownership, and then you won't need to replace the battery. So I'm looking for applications where there is active energy management on a regular basis. And fortunately, that really is, if you look at most analysts' projections of where the energy storage market is going, that is the lion's share of the market going forward. Right now, in the most active energy storage market, which is the United States, that tends to be dominated by short duration applications, frequency and voltage regulation, and short peak reductions. Those are good markets, they're high value, but they're small, and they will probably, and given the competition from high performance batteries, values will be driven lower. The US itself, given the nature of the grid, doesn't have as many high energy applications right now, although that will increase fairly rapidly in high penetration renewables areas. So we believe it's a combination of those high penetration renewables areas in the United States, plus the markets elsewhere, and the mining market is an excellent example of markets where batteries will be required for more or less daily duty to manage multiple hours of energy.
Yes, Ian.
I think it's a very, very important aspect, though, that has to be taken into consideration in storage. I mean, I'm a strong advocate of distributed generation systems, and I know this is not directly applicable to the mining environment, which is the basis of this conference. However, if you look at the utilities and the distribution companies, in South Africa's case, the municipalities, the distributed deployment of energy storage systems, whether it be batteries or that, in the suburbs and at their main sort of distribution substations, could have a profound impact on the overall system reliability going forward. Plus the deferment of, or not really the deferment of capital expenditure in terms of infrastructure upgrades, but the better utilization of that infrastructure. Because if the storage systems are located close to the point of demand, then as the demand varies, that storage system can buffer the feeder network to the actual point of demand. And there's a huge benefit there. With the rapid reduction in solar PV costs and the development of PV systems across rooftops, commercial, residential applications, mining applications. That variability that comes in from those systems during the day when you have maybe a lower demand in a residential type application because everyone's at work and at school and everything like that. Those systems, those PV systems pumping that energy back into the local storage system at the local suburban substation and then feeding that back in during the peak really has a tremendous benefit to the utilities, to the distributors, and ultimately to the consumer. And that's something that storage is doing. And the growth in the storage market in the United States, we're going to see a price trajectory very similar, maybe not hopefully as aggressive as the solar PV environment, where the cost of storage is going to come down because of volumes. I mean, everyone talks about the Tesla mega factory and their sexy dressed up lithium-ion battery. I mean, anything in a miniskirt looks good, but that's maybe not anything. Sorry, I just suddenly saw you in a miniskirt and it just scared the hell out of me. That's the benefit of storage, is that it allows us to move to a far more efficient energy transmission and distribution and utilization system.
Ian, that's a very interesting point. Do you think, though, because I've also got this vision, and I think I said it yesterday, that we'll be seeing a change in the landscape where at our homes we have a few panels on the roof and an inverter and then maybe a few batteries. But what you're saying is it should rather be done at the substation level. Do you think there's significant differences in efficiencies between those two? And the other question is, how will the typical city powers or the utilities deal with that in terms of the tariffs?
I think the reason why I say it's best suited at the substation level or at the city power level is because they can then effectively utilize, and assuming that they're a properly and prudently operated distributor of power, they can effectively utilize the system to its maximum benefit and maintain it. You know, household batteries, they're going to be shoved in a closet somewhere or into some sort of storage system, and I don't think you're going to get the sort of level of efficiency. You know, to put a flow battery in a home environment, Richard, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think that's really that viable. Whereas, you know, just down the street at your local sub, if you have another container there with a flow battery that's properly maintained and operated, I think could have far bigger benefit to the economy than individual homes and that.
I happen to agree with you, but let's hear what Richard says
No,
about that.
I completely agree with you. That is precisely what's happening in the U.S. So, high penetration renewables, the idea, many of you I'm sure have heard of the duck curve, which is first manifesting itself in the Los Angeles area, where there's so much distributed PV that the net load that the grid is seeing during the afternoon is actually lower than the minimum generation they need to maintain to hit the evening peak. And that is a gigantic opportunity for storage. It's a 3 or 4 opportunity, hour opportunity. It's great for flow batteries, and it's highly locational. You can't serve this with pumped storage 100 miles from LA. You've got to be right where the load is, and the substation is really going to be the center of that. One of our first projects is up in Puget Sound at an island across from Seattle, where we're providing end-of-line capacity for an all-electric island, which is having, especially in the winter, morning and evening peak issues. So we'll be providing extra capacity there. And if you look more generally in the United States at what's going on right now in storage and electricity market reform, the substation and distributed energy are really becoming the center of things. New York has launched what is probably the most ambitious reform project called New York REV, where they want to transition to an entirely distributed model for energy, and the substation or behind the meter, some residential but commercial and industrial, will become the locus for providing the flexibility that they're looking for. And I agree that residentially there is a role for some small-scale systems, but the much better level of aggregation is the substation level.
Excellent. That is kind of almost a mind changer in the sense that, you know, I haven't even considered that. I mean, I'm considering putting a few batteries to take us through the load shedding at home, and then the thing gets a bad name because you actually discharge the battery, and that's absolutely the ideal opportunity for the flow battery. I think we should, at this stage, get the lights up and get some questions from the audience, because you're dead quiet and I wouldn't want you to fall asleep. Having said, not that it is early in the morning. Having said that, I think this is a very, very good topic for let's call it a nice interactive. I can't see you, but can you introduce yourself and just
good morning.
Get a question to the panel, please?
Sure. You've spoken a lot about batteries and storage this morning, and a lot about the grid. But we're talking about mines in remote locations. So I just wanted to put to you that if I've got a 5 megawatt mine and I've got 2 megawatt ball mills each with a starting capacity of 2.5 times starting current, how do the batteries cope with that? What's your plan for how you will work on that kind of an application? Or does that not exist yet? Thank you.
Richard, are you going to answer that one? Because I was going to say that's perfectly in his space.
Yeah, I'm not sure I can give you the specs on your application, but anytime you look at a storage application, whether it's at a mine or it's in your backyard, you want to look at what the duty cycle is. And if what you're trying to solve for is a high power initial inrush current or power requirement coupled with an energy requirement, that may fall within the specs of a flow battery like mine, or you may need to hybridize the system to provide both the energy you need and the initial kick of high power to provide system stability. So you might take a flow battery and hybridize it with a lithium-ion battery, or perhaps some type of capacitor or flywheel. We'd have to look at that and do the applications modeling to understand whether storage makes sense, and then how much of what is the best combination.
I think if I could add to that, we heard Ian say, and I was actually surprised with thinking about it, a diesel generator in that system could almost be regarded as a battery, form of a battery, to get you over those peaks. It's a matter of economics at the end of the day. You've got to assess what the cost of the flow battery would be, what the capacity should be that you need, as opposed to other alternatives, and then make a conscious cost decision.
I think also what you've got to bear in mind is that, particularly for your off-grid applications, there is no one silver bullet. In the same way with renewables, people who say, solar is going to take over all the other technologies. Well, no. There's technologies to suit different environments and different applications, and it's exactly the same with energy storage, where you're going to need that. And what you say about diesel gensets, I tell you, people who say that the day of the diesel genset is over and that it's going to be replaced with renewables, that's not going to happen. The sun don't shine every day.
Exactly.
And you do need that as potentially as your point of last resort. So you either have your grid as last resort, or you have your diesel gensets or something like that. So there is no one silver bullet, and I think Richard's answer was really very, very clear. You've got to understand the application and design the system around that to suit the application and the specifics of your application.
And for those mechanical engineers in the audience, there's nothing that beats the startup of a V16 diesel. It just makes such a nice noise. Next question, please.
Hi, Ian Fielding, Shanta Gold. We operate an off-grid mine, and the discussion so far has largely been centered around storing energy that you can then bring back during, say, a 4-hour blackout from your grid. The situation is quite different when you don't have a grid connection, in that you have 100% reliable power available from your on-mine power generation plant. And what you might be looking for with battery storage or some form of energy storage is to reduce your average cost per kilowatt hour. If the sun shines for 8 hours a day out of the 24, then during that 8-hour period, if you have 1 megawatt of solar power available on, say, a 5 megawatt mine, as Manuel mentioned, then you can feed that in at an attractive cost, providing it's lower than the variable cost of operating your on-mine plant. But otherwise you can't, and therefore the cost of battery storage or any other means of storing energy might not be, or may still be, very expensive in that situation, whereas it might not be for countries where you do have a grid of sorts that gives you power most of the time. So I would ask if we could have a comment on whether the cost of batteries storage is reasonable in my situation.
Thanks, Ian. Could I add to that by just asking the panel, do you see the cost coming down, or do you see it increasing? Is it getting cheaper, or is it getting more expensive? Now that's putting Richard on the spot here, but
you're not really. I mean, this is the cost of batteries is coming down rapidly.
Is it really?
Yeah, you see this in the markets. Most dramatically, Elon Musk's announcement about the cost of his systems, the behind-the-meter systems, but generally in the market, there's a recognition. It's happening not just because the cost of producing batteries are falling, but because there's a recognition that we need to be at certain price levels to be economic. And I expect pricing pressures to remain intense for forever, basically. And our highest priority internally at the company, in addition to after developing a battery that works reliably to the specs that we've identified, is cost. It's all about cost. And we're optimistic on that. We believe there's great opportunity. Just briefly to Ian's question, you know, the goal here is not to place energy storage wherever we can. Although as a battery company, that's what I want to do. But the point here is the system optimization, and you want to meet whatever you want the batteries to support the overall goal for the end user, which is a combination of energy management, energy efficiency, reliability, lowering costs, carbon goals. And as Ian said, each storage, especially for mines, each application is going to be unique, and each customer, the technical requirements will be different, and the customer priorities will be different. And that will dictate not just whether you put storage in, but what and how much, and then what other types of base load you put in. For example, I agree with Ian. I think for applications like mining, diesel will be around for a long time. And the point is not to use storage to replace diesel. The point is to use storage to minimize the amount of diesel you're burning and to optimize for carbon, to optimize for reliability, to optimize for flexibility. And that's what it's about.
To your question, Ian, I mean, when you presented yesterday on your operation and the work that you've done, I mean, you mentioned that you've got Tenesco grid about 5 kilometers away, but it's not very reliable. Depending on the pricing coming from that grid, you know, if you had to put battery storage in and you basically charge the battery using the Tenesco grid, you then buffer the reliability issue of the grid away from your operation. You put a decent buffer in between there. So you're charging it with the lowest cost of energy that you've got, and you use that, again, to displace the more expensive diesel that you're having to utilize. So I really thought that some form of long-term storage technology would work very, very well in your application because of exactly that. The other great thing about storage technology is that you also can really control the quality of power going into your microgrid through an energy storage system. And you know, as you were saying, you know, your variable speed drives and soft starts and PLCs and some of the instrumentation that you have in a processing environment, a mineral processing environment, very, very sensitive to voltage fluctuations, frequency fluctuations, etc. And if you're working in a remote area, typically your power quality is pretty poor, and it's a great opportunity to look at it from that perspective.
Where's Adrian? Is there another question from the audience?
Yes, Gerhard. I know the panelists are well aware of this, but I would suggest that we've got to think of this as a system solution. Two things. I think we should defer from talking about a battery, because it focuses our mind on the battery per se, when in fact we're thinking, as you said, Gerhard, we must think of storage generically. And there are very, very many forms of storage. Mike, you just touched on it now, and I believe, in my view, in terms of the mining need, particularly in remote areas, the inverter is actually more important than the battery, in my view. And therefore, the sizing of the inverter to the load, the running load and the instantaneous load, needs to be very carefully considered, very, very carefully considered, as compared to the sizing of the battery. For exactly the reason that Mike mentioned. In mining remote places, they incur more losses due to voltage dips of a duration of a second or two than they do for power outages. Because the second or two dip takes out the process also for 8 hours, particularly if the process, let's say for example, is pumping slurry or some other medium that has to be dumped. I'll give you one example. We spoke to the extruders in this country on power outages. If they lose power completely unexpectedly, it takes them days to clean the extruders, days of lost production. Whereas if they had a properly sized inverter with a properly sized battery that can give them very short term, right through to that thing, they would actually save themselves more money than basically investing in massive amount of storage, for which really their need was for those short-term voltage outages. So I would suggest the inverter needs to be very carefully considered as a critically important component in the solution, and the sizing thereof. From a utility perspective, consider the fact, and picking up on your point of distributed power, Mike, that inverters can dispatch either on voltage, they can even dispatch on frequency. So you could contract with a utility to have automatic frequency compensation so that they don't have to balance the system's frequency, particularly on a distributed power point of view. So I'm merely just putting out there that we should think more generically around storage and really not underestimate the importance of that inverter.
Mike, thank you for that. I think that's a very important point. And in fact, Ian had touched on that in terms of power quality.
Yeah.
You want to comment?
Yeah. Yesterday, the point was raised that technically the solutions are out there. The regulatory environment that we're operating in doesn't exist to allow us to start contracting on that basis. You know, hence the reason why I suggested that energy storage at a substation level, suburban substation level, being part of the equipment mix that a City Power or a Chwani Power or Takwini Power has, is where storage has a very, very good fit from a distributed power and storage specification, because then they can utilize all the aspects and benefits of storage that Mike has alluded to.
Interesting. Mike, thanks for raising that. I think we should make that a topic of another discussion in future on power quality, because it's really important. Are there any more questions from the, oh, there are many. Adrian, how are we for time? Because just before we finish, I want to give Ian an opportunity to put something on the board that will excite us all in terms of the practical application which is happening now in batteries, which is really interesting.
It's probably time. We've got just under 10 minutes. So
Okay, that's great.
yeah.
So could we have, there was a question at the back there.
Is that working? Yeah. Thanks for the excellent presentations. My name is Ralph Beryl from Canadian Solar. As a solar guy, you know, we make the argument that solar is a hedge to unpredictable fuel costs going forward, and I would imagine the same can be made for storage as well. Effectively, it's all capital up front, maybe a degree of O&M costs, but that should be a major consideration in terms of long-term economic planning. Remember that, you know, in addition to variable fuel prices, the quality of fuel, the availability of fuel, these are critical things that mines, I imagine, are dealing with right now. And if you can somehow, you know, eat into that risk that the fuel cost poses to the mine with a storage solution, then you're doing something good. I think the other comment is, I think storage will really become more attractive when the guys that are providing the technology have the bankability long term, that customers know that, you know, that technology will be able to be serviced long term. The company's not going to go bust, and is underwritten by a large balance sheet, and that's another consideration. That'll be real maturity when that day arrives.
Thank you. I think that's a very good point. But the point that you're also making is that one has to look at the whole system holistically, and not only look at the storage part or the generation part or the fuel part, which is a very good point. Thanks for that. Do you want to comment?
Yeah, I mean, it's exactly that. You've got to consider the system, and it's one of the integral components that goes into the overall system design. Where we've gotten to in the life cycle of energy storage development is that it's now falling into the cost bracket that makes it an economically viable part of your overall system system design. Whereas previously it was prohibitively expensive, and therefore generally we left it out of our system design thinking.
Let's do one more question.
Hello. Hi, it's Rob Ledan from Hatch. Hey, I have a question regarding some of my clients' inquiries pertains to energy storage, and specifically, people are asking for a pricing unit of measure for batteries that makes sense in their sort of context. And I'll give you the example. If we talk about diesel power, diesel power is per kilowatt hour, but if in the paradigm of batteries, it would be like dollars per horsepower. And we're wondering if in the battery industry we can go from dollars per megawatt of storage capacity to some other unit of measure that describes the round trip efficiency the cyclability, the O&M cost from a maintenance standpoint, this type of holistic pricing mechanism.
Yeah, I can respond to that. Yeah, that's so. One of the things about batteries, when you're looking at an application and you're trying to understand how batteries with highly different performance and characteristics and capital costs would perform, or you're looking in general to understand how a single battery technology would perform, you need a common metric. You need to compare different things against a common metric, and so we typically do that with a levelized cost of energy calculation, LCOE calculation. So what you'll do, and typically for long duration storage, you'll take a 4 or a 6 hour duty cycle over 20 years, and you'll compare different batteries, or just do it for a single battery in an application, using all the inputs, so the capital cost of the battery, the cost of input energy, your O&M costs, the cycle life, any projected replacements, cost of money, over whatever term you wanna compute the LCOE. Typically we do it for 20 years, and we'll come up with a levelized cost of energy, the cost of a kilowatt hour of energy discharged from the battery. And that's really what you're trying to look for, and that's what I believe Ian is looking at when he's doing the economics of his project against diesel. This is going to be different in every situation, because every situation is going to have you're going to have different elements of that metric. You're going to have different costs of input energy, different required duration, perhaps different, maybe the frequency of use is going to be different. So it's a more complex thing to do, but you can absolutely reduce it to the figures that are important to you, which is the most important number is on a complete basis, what's the cost of a kilowatt hour of energy from the system.
Correct. Thanks, Richard. Does that answer your question? I think at the end of the day, it's a cent per kilowatt hour cost, taking into account the input costs and capital costs and all of that. But it is time that we start quoting those type of figures. You're absolutely right.
Yeah, I raise it because it confuses the clients, the number of different variables that go into it, and understand that there is some complexity with simplifying it to help that.
Yeah, good point.
Yeah, we deal with that every day.
Good. Okay, I don't want to cut the session short because it's really turning out very interesting. Is there any more burning questions before we can close the session and take you through the practical application of a plane currently flying around the world? Adrienne, would you agree? Ian, could I then ask you to take us through that, because it's hugely exciting. The practical application of storage at the moment is happening, and it's really I think changing the way that we're going to be thinking about aviation in the future, as well as storage. Please.
Can you pull up that webpage? So what you're seeing there, okay, it's not quite a live feed from the cockpit, but okay. Anyway, what you're seeing there is the webpage from the Solar Impulse program that's currently underway. Solar Impulse is a solar-powered aircraft, basically designed by André Bouchard and Bertrand Picard in Switzerland. That they developed over the last 15 years, and it's currently flying around the world using solar power only and energy storage, most importantly. The profile that you see on that screen, that's a live profile. The plane's been flying from Japan, Anglo, Japan, and it's en route to Hawaii. It's been airborne going for 3.5 days. Yeah, just click on that one. So it's flown 6,000 kilometers. Yeah. 3.5 days. It's been flying continuously using solar power and energy storage. You can't, over the Pacific Ocean. I mean, you know, if the system doesn't work, he lands in the sea. And there's sharks and all sorts of crap down there. So, you know, and there it is. He's flying at night. It's 9:30 at night where the plane is currently. Just go back to the profile page. You can see the bottom profile, the white profile, that's the battery storage capacity at the moment. What they've been doing is they've been using a combination of potential energy storage by climbing an altitude. They're climbing up to about 30,000 feet every single day when the sun is shining. So the aircraft climbs up to 30,000 feet. They timed it so that they peak out at about 30,000 feet just as the sun's setting. They go into what they call the energy neutral period, where the aircraft then glides back down to about between 5,000 and 8,000 feet, and then they loiter at between 5,000 and 8,000 feet using battery power, waiting for the sun to come up again for the solar cells on the wings and fuselage to then start recharging the batteries and allow them to start climbing up again. And this is what energy storage can do, and proper energy management is capable of. And this is live, real time. The guy is sitting. I just wish the little YouTube feed there was not showing the future is clean promotion that they're pushing for in line with the next COP meeting. But you know, that's really what's happening right now with energy storage. And it's a remarkable example of the combination of renewables plus storage plus proper energy management. Please don't underestimate that. Energy management is a critical factor in everything that we're doing. And as the world and the planet becomes more and more stressed by too many peoples and such demand on the limited resources there, the management of energy becomes a bigger and bigger issue. And hence the requirement for technology, smart grids, and the clever people sitting in this conference. There we go. So there's Andre in the cockpit. That's a live feed from the cockpit. You can see it's dark at night, and he's been flying that plane for 3.5 days, from Japan all the way through to Honolulu. And they're on a trip around the world, flying back to Abu Dhabi.